while of course pro-lifers oppose abortion because it's killing the innocent unborn, we also, at the very least, would want a woman getting an abortion to be able to get care later if she needed it.
The Supreme Court recently struck down a Louisiana law that required abortion providers to have admitting privileges at nearby hospitals. Here to talk about this is Alexandra DeSanctis, who's been closely covering this story for National Review. And right now she has a piece up called June Medical is Another Disappointment for Pro-Lifers. Alexandra, thanks for being here. Could you quickly summarize the main points and main arguments of this case?
Sure. So the law before the court was a Louisiana policy, as you said, requiring abortionists to have admitting privileges at a local hospital. The idea being that if something goes wrong for the woman during an abortion procedure, she can easily be admitted to a hospital for further treatment if she needs it. And the argument the state was making was that a similar policy already applies under state law to every other surgical center in the state. You know, if you're getting any other kind of outpatient surgery, your doctor has to have admitting privileges at a local hospital, and the policy was aiming to require the same of abortion providers. And abortion providers sued. The case ended up before the Supreme Court, and the court decided in a 5-4, but really a 4-1 for kind of a strange decision that the law was unconstitutional under a previous precedent, Whole Woman's Health, which considered a similar admitting privileges law in Texas and struck it down. And the reason I say it was 4-1-4 is that the four, I guess you could say, liberal-leaning justices on the court struck down the Louisiana law using the same rationale as Whole Woman's Health. But Chief Justice John Roberts, who dissented in Whole Woman's Health and would have upheld the Texas law, said that while he still believed Whole Woman's Health was wrong, that the Texas law ought to have been upheld, because that case had been decided the way it was, he was required to decide against the Louisiana law too because of precedent. So he used kind of a stare decisis argument for striking down the Louisiana law, which is really very frustrating as a pro-lifer to watch that happen, to see that he still thinks Whole Woman's Health was wrong, but he wasn't willing to use this as an opportunity to reverse that poor decision.
And could you go very briefly into what the differences are between Whole Woman's Health and this case that was just decided? Because I'm seeing a lot of talk in media reports and elsewhere on social media about how these cases were identical.
Sure, they were certainly very similar because they had to do with similar admitting privileges laws. But one of the arguments that Louisiana was making was that the other side, the abortion providers, could not illustrate that this would actually result in the closure of any abortion clinics, which was distinct from Texas, where I think more than a dozen clinics likely would have closed because doctors wouldn't have been able, or I guess abortionists would not have been able to obtain admitting privileges. And so the argument from the other side, from abortion rights proponents, is that would be an undue burden, to use the language of Planned Parenthood versus Casey, an undue burden on women. And in Whole Woman's Health, the court kind of came up with a new standard saying essentially, yes, this would be a problem for women who are trying to access abortion because clinics would actually be closing. But in Louisiana, the state was arguing there wouldn't actually be any closures. Any abortionist who is up to code, up to standards, would very easily be able to get these. And if they can't, then it's not good for women to be attending those clinics, right? So they were trying to distinguish, I guess, based on the specific effects of the law.
I know this decision is rather long, more than 100 pages, but are there any decisions that particularly struck you that you would like to point out?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you want to kind of get to the heart of the matter and figure out exactly what was at stake in this case, you obviously could read the whole thing. I would recommend skipping the liberal justices' majority opinion. You kind of know what it's going to say. They basically just uphold Whole Woman's Health and apply it to this case. So if you want to get the heart of this and do some thorough reading, but not the entire thing, I would recommend reading Justice Roberts' concurring opinion just to get a sense of why he's arguing and using stare decisis in this way, and sort of his, I guess, philosophy, you might call it, on these sorts of cases. And then I would highly recommend reading Justice Clarence Thomas's dissent, which not only disagreed with the standing question, which we could get into, I suppose, but so he obviously disagreed with the opinion in this case, but he basically said all of our abortion jurisprudence is rot. It's got to go. Roe has no founding in the Constitution. This court has to address all of that. And so it's really kind of heartening to read as a pro-lifer. You wish that could be the majority opinion, but worth reading nonetheless.
What does this decision mean for women and women's health? How does that translate?
Yeah, so what's really frustrating about this case is like I mentioned, it was brought by abortion providers challenging the Louisiana law. And what's interesting about that is that abortion providers are not the people getting abortions, right? They're profiting from women seeking abortion. So if someone is being infringed upon or having their abortion rights, one might say, infringed upon, it would be Louisiana women. And yet in this case, you don't have Louisiana women as plaintiffs or petitioners. You don't have Louisiana women saying this law was preventing me from getting an abortion when I needed one. You have abortionists suing the state on behalf of women, allegedly. And the state's making the argument, look, these people have a financial motivation for women to get abortions, to not have to follow the same regulations as other providers. That's not a good situation for women. If women have a problem with it, they should challenge it. But abortionists don't have the standing to challenge on the behalf of women. And unfortunately, that's a question that the majority decision really glossed over. But I think the result of that is that women end up in a situation where the state is not requiring abortionists to follow the same policy, or it's not permitted to require abortionists to follow the same policy as any other surgical provider. And so they're in a situation perhaps where they might go to an abortion clinic, have some kind of, very serious side effect, and then have trouble getting into a local hospital because their abortion provider may not be able to get them in there. And, of course, those situations are rare, but they do happen. And the state has documented things like this taking place, and it's happened in plenty of other states. And so, while, of course, pro-lifers oppose abortion because it's killing the innocent unborn, we also, at the very least, would want a woman getting an abortion to be able to get care later if she needed it. And even that bare minimum has not been met now.
There's so many media headlines out there talking about different aspects of this case. What should Americans be keeping in mind when they're reading media stories, and what would you like to see in coverage of this case?
Yeah, I think what's really frustrating is that, it's obviously a long decision. It's kind of complicated. The legal details are complicated. And so the average person, understandably, isn't going to be diving into that or looking into the details very much or trying to parse all of it. And so all they're going to get is sort of the headlines or the basic coverage from mainstream sites. And they're all kind of pitching this as, a win for women's healthcare. And sort of as I just outlined in that last question, this isn't even a regulation or a limitation on accessing abortion at all. This is merely requiring abortionists to have admitting privileges, to have a situation where women can get follow-up care if they need it. And so to spin that as a victory for women's health care or reproductive rights or something like that, I think is just so dishonest. That's really not, limiting abortion, restricting abortion was not what was at stake here. This was about just getting the bare minimum of care for women who do seek an abortion. So I think that would be what I would recommend people keep in mind as they read the coverage of this.
How would you say that the pro-life movement should be reacting to this whole case? What should they be keeping in mind, and how should they be responding to this case?
That's a really tricky question, honestly, because the legal strategy of the pro-life movement is complex. And I think it, in large part, has been just letting individual states and Republican or often Democratic legislatures, pro-life legislatures, get these laws through, and then knowing they'll be challenged and trying to get something before the court that will either allow them a chance to possibly strike down Casey and Roe, or even to just start rolling back in small ways the just awful abortion jurisprudence that we have. And I think this case, a lot of pro-lifers were hopeful that it would be an occasion to overturn whole women's health. It was, and because of Justice Roberts, that didn't happen. And so to me, I think it sort of calls for perhaps a little bit more boldness on the part of pro-lifers, take a leaf out of Justice Thomas's book and go for the whole hog, try to overturn Roe. And that's not to knock incrementalism, because I think the pro-life movement has had a lot of success sort of pushing back bit by bit here and there. And we have had victories, but at the same time, when the foundation of our abortion jurisprudence is so wrong, it's so poorly decided, and so much of the resulting situation we have is messed up because of that, I think somehow the strategy has to take that into account and perhaps be a little bit bolder.